Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Divided Films, the podcast where audiences and critics do not agree on movies and we pick sides. With me, as always, is my co-host Keith.
Hello.
And joining us today back on the podcast is my amazing fiance, Eric Tauro. And joining us for the first time is his cousin, Gene and
Enriquez.
I knew it, and for some reason I doubted myself at the last second. Gene Enriquez.
Happy to be here.
Glad to be back.
Good to have you guys. Obviously Eric on. Eric's always like with me anyway when I'm recording. And then Gene, to have you on while you're in town. It's good to have you on. So today we're talking about the 2005 drama Memoirs of a Geisha, directed by Rob Marshall. This movie falls into the category of having a negative score with critics and a positive score with audiences. On Rotten Tomatoes, only 35% of critics approve, 83% of audiences approve. So like nearly a 50% difference there. And the critics' consensus: less nuanced than its source material, Memoirs of a Geisha may be a lavish production, but it still carries the simplistic air of a soap opera. So there you have it. This is one falling with audiences won over, but critics not so much. And one of like our bigger differences. For me, this is like actually my first time seeing Memoirs of a Geisha. I did not catch it when it first came out, roughly 15, 16 years ago. But I know some of you guys have actually seen this one before, so we'll start with Gene and Eric. What is your experience with this movie, and are you surprised that audiences enjoy it more than the critics?
Sure, I can start. I am the older between the two of us, so I might have firmer recollection of
He knows more.
2005.
The wiser one.
So yeah, I was excited when this movie was announced. I knew a little bit about the novel that had been really popular in America at the time, but I always grew up really interested in Japanese culture. Had a lot of Japanese friends growing up in East Asia where I grew up. Anime, movies, Akira Kurosawa films like Seven Samurai, Yojimbo, and Ran, and then the Last Samurai came out a couple years before that, which I really enjoyed, which I'm pretty sure was also a divided film.
I think so.
Yeah, but when this came out, I was really, really excited hearing about it. But I do remember it was an interesting year. There were a lot of big movies, so it might not have gotten the same, the same audience rapport as those other big movies. But I think it was a good timepiece, and I think what I really enjoyed about it most was the storytelling. I don't know about you, Eric. I think that's what most people liked.
I did like the storytelling. I cinematography is clearly beautiful as well. For this movie, I think I remember watching it with you, June, because you would introduce me to all these movies as a kid. I was like a young teenager at that time, and this movie really excited me because I was actually super obsessed with Asian culture. I was super Asian pride at that time. I had AIM, Zenga, and I had like Asian Pinoy, Asian Islander screen names. So even my bedroom had like a Japanese symbol of love, and it had like dragons and the Buddha, and I had like everything Asian in my bedroom. A giant fortune cookie pillow. So that's the thing. Like this movie excited me. It's something that I really love looking at because I love the beauty and culture of a country and how they portray that, as well as showing the artistry. Like geishas are like beautiful artists. They're able to really communicate their craft well, and I think this is something that was definitely a good introduction for Americans to see, but obviously we're going to find out there's more to it than that. So
yeah, I totally agree. I think the visuals, it was, the cinematography was beautiful. This is the same director that did, was it Moulin Rouge or Chicago? One of those.
Chicago.
Right? So, really colorful. There were some things about it that, that stuck out for me to this day. continue to bother me. I haven't seen the movie since it came out in 2005 until I watched it again recently just to catch up on the story. But I think the biggest distraction of all was the casting, which I think historically has been noted as the biggest problem a lot of people had with this movie, because it was mostly, at least the leads were mostly Chinese and not Japanese.
They're all from like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. They just basically took popular Asian actors at the time.
Yeah.
Ken Watanabe is the only Japanese actor, I believe.
Of the main cast.
Koji,
Of the main
yeah,
cast, yes.
yeah, Koji Yokoshida is the Mr. Nobu. He was a big Japanese actor as well.
Yeah, so it seemed like a lot of the male characters were cast as from Japanese actors, but then a lot of the female characters were portrayed by Chinese actresses, which is interesting.
Yeah.
What's your history with this movie, Keith?
This is my first time seeing it. Yeah, this movie came out like 15 years ago, and not a lot of 15-year-olds were rushing to the theaters at the time. And I wasn't really that interested in movies that were nominated for the Oscars that weren't Lord of the Rings. Uh, this movie has a lot, like they really kind of came out, like all the heavy hitters came out for this. Like John Williams actually wanted to do the score for this. The cinematography is beautiful. The art direction is beautiful. It was nominated for 7 Oscars and won for 3. And yet I can't help but feel it was a little bored. I was a little bored by it.
Sure, that makes sense.
I I don't think there was. I think there was a. I feel like I'm looking at something beautiful, but there's not. There wasn't a lot of depth to it,
Right.
or at least there wasn't a lot of emotional. That I really couldn't connect to it, and uh, there was a lot of critic consensus or little critic quotes that I read that I'm like, oh, that makes sense for me.
Yeah.
But that's kind of where I'm at for it. It was still like it's not a full out bad movie, but it just Rob Marshall kind of, aside from Chicago, he's kind of made a lot of boring movies after that for me.
Yeah. I get that. It's kind of, for a lot of critics, a very surface level film. Yes, it's very beautiful, but I think the critics wish there was maybe more investment in the character development and maybe more of, I don't know, maybe more like an in depth story, like the writing in particular. I mean, it's based on a novel, but they like the word that comes out or the term that comes out is like soap opera. They're saying this, so maybe a very fluffy kind of story, which that's their take. I don't know if I really get that myself. I can see how people can be a little bored with this movie, but I was enjoying it. This is also my, like I said, my first time watching it, and I've always been interested in Japanese culture. I've never done like a deep dive into a film that really explored that. Except maybe, I've always been a fan of like Hayao Miyazaki movies, which explores a lot of themes with that culture.
Great
But
movies.
watching this, yeah, I guess I am more focused a lot on things like production value, like the sets are beautiful, the locations are beautiful, the cinematography, things like that, because those are the things that stand out the most. And then story wise, I don't know. I kind of went along with it. I kind of like the idea that this main character, is uh, becoming better and better at being a geisha and like quickly rising up the ranks. There's a lot of elements about the story that I liked, but so I wouldn't totally say this is like a soap opera type story. There's elements of that where it gets a bit over dramatic, but I wouldn't say that it's total fluff with nothing at all to think about.
No, I agree. I appreciate with how, it's a very linear story. It starts with Chio as a little girl, and how, she's taken away from her parents and then taken to a geisha house, and then how she develops from there. And it really just follows a linear path until the end, right? So it, I think it gave enough, at least to follow Chio slash Sayuri along the way. But you're right. There's so many characters, so many important characters, like someone like Mr. Nobu, who has like a big impact on all of their lives, but he just comes in as, the really strict disciplinarian guy that's a war veteran, and has, all sorts of issues. But they don't really deep dive into those characters who really play big roles, or for the chairman for that matter. You know, that her love, her love is based on the fact that he gave her a handkerchief when she was a kid, and you know, it never really develops him, right? Other than just someone that she remembers very well. You know what I mean?
It's weird how she just clearly just fell in love as a little girl with him, and she kept that handkerchief so creepy a little bit, and like keeping it in her little like container.
Some people in the audience comments, and I kind of noticed it too, but it's kind of grooming in a way ish, maybe. It like you get a little like irksome, like oh, it's an older man going up to this 7-year-old girl,
Yeah. It's
going
it's he's much he's I mean like he's much older obviously, and when you find out at the end that he basically like remembered who she was and was responsible for making her into a geisha, like that's a nice twist and all, but I that's one thing I don't like about the story is that they do kind of end up together at the end. I would have maybe have preferred if okay, she's driven by this childhood crush on an older man who was nice to her, but maybe towards the end she like learns to have other values and find more strength within herself that she can be driven by other things besides this very blind and immature love for a much older man.
Exactly. I feel like that's the soap opera part of it. It's just kind of extreme how they really focused on that, and they, like you said, we really love seeing the develop of her. Geisha is such a distinct artistry that you really have to gain a lot of your skills, like you know, as a kid. That's where they start as younger, being I think the Maiku, being their little like apprentices.
Like apprentices and servants, you know, kind of doing grunt work until they're old enough to really take on the, you know, bigger responsibilities of being a geisha. I mean, I totally get that there's way more to being a geisha than this movie's portraying, but I don't think this movie really focuses as much on stereotypes, like misleading stereotypes of geishas being sex workers, which is a false stereotype. I don't think this movie plays into that at all, really. They kind of touch on it a little bit. I get a sense that it's a very small portion, a very small element of being a geisha. But I feel like this movie, if anything, led me down the road of, oh, geishas aren't sex workers. Geishas actually have a lot of skills, and they're very sophisticated. They aren't what a lot of Americans at the time thought, which was maybe just like high-end prostitutes.
Yeah, I don't think in the original like mandate, because there were laws passed that that regulated how geishas were, how they operated in you know, feudal as in 14th century Japanese society. They were not meant to be sex workers. They were meant to be entertainers. They were like the
Hosts.
the supermodels slash, you know, singers and entertainers of the time. So if you consider, you know, we don't consider them you know, sex workers, right? So
They're not.
right. So, but I think that's what the big misconception was, and I think that's where we run into a lot of not understanding what's happening in the movie, just because here in the West, and I'll say, you know, as a Westerner, although I have Asian origins, you know, didn't fully or don't fully understand, you know, the geisha culture. I think the end, I think it makes sense to a degree, because, you know, she is trying so hard to get out of being a geisha, and, you know, one, I guess she never finds her sister in the end, but, you know, live happily ever after, which, and I think to your point about the age difference, that's not extremely uncommon in Japanese culture either, for there to be such a huge age gap between, or Asian culture for that matter, have an age gap between spouses.
Yeah, 18 years is normal. I remember hearing about 12 years, 18 years age gaps. And
Okay, so I guess maybe that is something looking through a more modern lens, you know, into a different culture in the past.
Agony and beauty for us live side by side. Your feet will suffer. Your fingers will bleed. Even sitting and sleeping will be painful. You cannot call yourself a true geisha until you can stop a man in his tracks with a single look.
Another thing I like is that this is basically also a movie about the end of the geisha era, right? Because you get into the World War II portion, and just when this character is like the top of her field and her craft of being a geisha, it all comes crashing down. And she even says like all of that training and work was almost for nothing, because then she has to spend years working like, out in the country, trying to do whatever she can to survive. So I find that interesting too. Any subject matter about the end of an era is always an interesting story to tell.
Absolutely.
But that's the thing. I believe that the fact that the whole concept of geisha is misconstrued because of the war. Like, I think that a lot of the prostitutes, because there were prostitutes there, but they called themselves geisha girls, I believe. And I think that's what kind of like titled these geishas to be these prostitutes, and that's not what they are.
They hinted at that. They hinted at the fact that maybe the term geisha after the war became corrupted, and some of these people maybe were playing into the misconceptions that Westerners had. I mean, you had that colonel character, that American colonel, who immediately assumes that he's going to be able to have sex with one of these geishas, and that is that again, he represents someone who has no idea what a geisha is.
Yeah, I like how they transition though. You see how when they transition from like the war, like it's really strange. The war just kind of like all of a sudden happens. Although Japan had been expanding across Asia during the time period of the movie, but when the war hits the mainland, there's this abrupt change. Then she goes off into the country for a little while. But I like how they did that, and then she comes back, and Kyoto is a whole different city, right? Mm-hmm. I think she even Sayuri in the narration says something like, "Well, anyone now wearing makeup and a kimono is a geisha."
Exactly.
And it shows the start of the end. Sorry, Keith.
No, wasn't Pumpkin? Didn't Pumpkin? She ended up becoming an escort, right? If I'm not yeah.
Very
so
loose.
like it's not. Yeah, yeah. She's like, I couldn't make it. I'm not quite as good as you, so I have to do it my own way. So it's like I I I really didn't know that much about geishas. I think I just knew the imagery, and I knew they weren't sex workers. I wasn't getting that. I took it as like high end artists slash ego boosters. They're like they are definitely boosting the egos of these men around them.
Right,
In a very talented way.
Their clients were usually middle-aged men, right, with money.
Yeah,
basically.
Influencers in society. So remember, it was like Mr. Nobu who had the factory at first, and then by the post-war era, it was the colonel who worked for the the American military governor who could influence business or the future of that part of Japan.
I think there are different types of escorts, right? There's a sexual escorts, then there's a companion like host escorts that are just come to parties and they're there to be the companion.
Girlfriend experience.
Companionship.
No, that's still a thing today. Actually, there are like hotels in Japan where you just can hire someone to hug you for several hours, and that's as much as you get. It's very, it's a very different culture because, not to speak too much about cultures, but they're very focused and can be very emotionally detached when it comes to the workplace, and when they go home or when they don't have a home to go to, strong emotions. So I think that's why geishas kind of developed too.
You mentioned earlier about how the World War II element of the story hits suddenly about, like, I don't know, with maybe 30 or 40 minutes left in the film. But, like, so the timeline of this story, she's a little girl who's taken away from her home in 1929, I believe. That's what I read. And then, she's growing up in, like, the 30s. And so I think when it jumps from her being a young girl to, like, a young woman, I think that's probably like a span of 7 years or so. So then by then you're in the mid 30s, mid to late 30s.
Yeah.
And from what I know from history, Japan, you're right, had been expanding since the early 30s
or the 20s. And they started with Korea in the 20s,
right.
And then China in the 30s.
Right, and you can maybe make the argument that World War II in the Pacific Theater had started by then. And you even have a line when Ken Watanabe is talking about him and the how Nobu saved his life while they were fighting in Manchuria. And see, that's where it gets kind of tricky for me, because I know that like Manchuria was just a time when like the Japanese army was committing atrocities in that part of China. So it makes me think they gloss over these like darker parts of that time period. And I know that's not the focus of the story, but maybe just don't even mention it, because that is like kind of opening a small window into this whole other part of what was going on at the time, that like, you bring it up, and it warrants a little curiosity.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, JJ. When I first saw the film, it was one of the first things I thought about, because it was an all Chinese cast. I don't know if you remember, or if you guys might have read that. I think the movie was even banned in China for a while because,
Yeah.
Zhang Ziyi, she's a Beijing actress. The Rape of Nanking was 1936. The Chinese population, or at least the Chinese government, in many ways found, Zhang Ziyi and Li Gong Li, they were kind of betraying their own people from their perspective. So the movie didn't release I don't know if it ever did release in China.
Which is funny, because I would think, not funny, but maybe ironic then is the better way to say it, because I would think the from what I read, the choice to cast those actresses was based on their star power, but their star power as Chinese stars, right? I don't think American audiences were as familiar with them as, say, like, they had star power in China. And I think this was mid 2000s is when Hollywood really started to focus on their worldwide box office, which China contributes significantly to. So to make that decision, which ultimately leads to the film not airing in that market, probably was like a huge backfire. And like they were counting on this movie maybe being a huge hit in China. And it turned out to just be a very like sore subject.
That's the thing. I think they did choose actors based on their stardom, and the thing with Western culture over here in America, we really view all Asians to be similar. Like we think that we're all the same ethnicity or whatnot, but that's the thing. No one can tell, but a lot of, I guess for us, we can tell, especially how these actors, even how they act. Like I remember we talk about how Japanese culture things are like kind of more rigid in performance.
Yeah.
Is that what it is? So they had more fluidity, I guess, especially during the band dancing. Like there's differences. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I guess was one of my, the characters being Chinese really, I guess from the first time I saw it, it still impacts me today. And we were talking about that, the rigidity of, if you watch kabuki dancers or any other Japanese art, it's very deliberate and like choppy, whereas the Chinese dancing is very, fluid and flowy, and it really bothered me, even to this day. But I think what really is, I think the character development was good to a degree. The Chinese actresses, I think they were pretty good. They did a good job portraying the story. But I think, from my humble opinion, they were portraying geishas from their perspective. What a Chinese woman in her mid-30s, early 30s, which is probably what they were at the time, how they interpreted a geisha from being. So I would imagine that if there were reviews out there from the Japanese audience, that they probably couldn't suspend the disbelief either, saying that, these are Chinese interpretations of what Japanese culture looked like. So that was always a bit problematic for me.
The tidbits that I found about the whole controversy, according to one of the producers, Lucy Fisher, the producers did hold an open day audition for Japanese actresses to come out, but no one did turn out to audition. I like, and that's according to her. Like, I don't know what that means. Like, she holds like an open sign, like, come in,
Yeah, open
come
casting
in.
call, like, tell all the agents, tell all the, throughout the industry. And I guess the response was really not a response at all.
Pumpkin was Japanese. I forget her name. The lady that played Pumpkin was Japanese. But again, you said star power. That's really what it was. Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and all the that
Joy Luck Club.
That stream of movies that came out.
Michelle Yeoh was a Bond. She was a Bond girl. Like people knew who she was.
That's
And
true.
Ken Watanabe's coming right off of The Last Samurai.
And he would appear later in that year in Batman Begins.
He did. Yeah.
Michelle Yeoh, I really like that actress, and she hasn't really seemed to have aged much at all in the last 15 years, having seen her recently in movies like Crazy Rich Asians and
Asians don't age.
Another movie we actually talked about last year. What was it? Last Christmas, right? She was in that, and she looks exactly the same as she did back in 2005. She probably was maybe the most obvious actor who was not Japanese, just because I feel like they didn't really make her, like, at least with the other actors, they have more of the hairstyles that fit in, the darker hair. I feel like with her, she had like lighter hair and just something about her. She kind of stood out throughout the whole movie because she does not, the way about her and the way like she wears herself and everything was way different than all the other female characters in the movie. So I don't know what the choice was there, but that kind of stood out to me. Like she kind of doesn't really go by how everyone else is keeping themselves.
And that's why I think what's like stopping this movie from being really great. And that's one of the things to me, because the more I read like the backstory and like the everything outside of this movie, uh, like Steven Spielberg was going to like he produced this movie or executive produced this. Like you see Amblin Productions in the opening credits, and he was going to make this movie after Saving Private Ryan, and he wanted to do it with an all Jap. He was going to do it in Japan with an all Japanese cast, and like they were gonna. It was going to be subtitled
I was actually
too. So
thinking that, like, I probably would have really taken this movie a lot more seriously if it was spoken in Japanese, which probably would not have gone over as well with American audiences, but that would have definitely made it more authentic. And the fact that they all are speaking in English, to me, makes it seem less authentic because they're catering to an American audience, right? I feel like you definitely would have had some people coming in. I mean, if it was directed by Steven Spielberg, people are gonna go. And
especially after Private Ryan, like
right, I think that's interesting. This movie, maybe with the people who are interested in getting involved, it could have been like a huge Hollywood event, and I think it was still promoted as such at the time. But because Steven Spielberg had to step back creatively, it wound up being not as much of like a monumental release as it could have been.
That was probably the box office like risk they had to, balance out. Do we want to have a movie with less than known Japanese actors, actresses for that matter, actually, and take the risk not knowing how they would perform versus what they already had and known quantity out of Zhang Ziyi and Michelle Yeoh and Li Gong, who were really established already at the time after those kung fu movies in the early 2000s, and they went with the latter. Again, I don't think their acting was bad. It just, like you said, didn't come off as authentic for those that appreciate or that are into Japanese culture.
Remember the beginning? They actually spoke Japanese and there wasn't a word of English.
That's
I actually
right.
like that. It was really cool how they did that in the beginning.
Yeah, because it got awkward to the end because when they were speaking English to the Americans, there was no sudden change, right? It's as if they were speaking English the entire time.
It sounded the same as when they were talking to themselves.
And, there was no kind of period where they showed they had to learn English because they probably wouldn't have spoken English in the 30s, So it made for an awkward transition from my view.
It would have been, I could see the chairman and Mr. Nobu maybe having some knowledge of English, being like businessmen who are trying to get into like Western business, like they would have made an effort to learn some English. But you're right, not the geisha characters. They, especially since they come from like a smaller populated area. Like I know, what was the name of the town that this movie takes place mostly in?
I believe it's Kyoto, which is the second or third largest Japanese city, but it's in a small.
I thought it was called something else, like something starting with an M. But yeah, you're right. That's something. It's like we just assume. I didn't even realize. We just kind of like go with it that they're just speaking English to these Americans, and because it's in the same way they speak to themselves, it goes kind of unnoticed unless you really think about it, and it doesn't add up.
I was thinking maybe because with the subtitle situation, I think a lot of people would have had to focus too much, and I think the fact that this movie was kind of slow, like they like to just have that balance of trying to be able to focus as well as keep up with how how Subway felt.
It might have been less dialogue in the movie then, because if you have a lot of subtitles, that might distract from the cinematography and the beautiful like landscapes they're showing. I feel like even the sets. So this is all filmed on sets and sound stages for the most part, of like the with the Japanese architecture and everything of the town. I thought that all looked really great. It was like
Oh yeah.
first rate production, and I liked looking at all that and seeing like the Japanese architecture and stuff like that. So maybe if you were to do it all in Japanese, I wonder if you would have had much less dialogue and maybe focused more on telling the story visually, with the characters just learning the art form and that way, which again would have been like I would have really appreciated something like that, but maybe not something that American audiences are used to.
Don't you think that probably would have worked like now, like 2021, where you have these great set pieces and the movie? Now American audiences in particular are more accustomed to things that are subtitled, like Parasite won the Academy.
That's great.
Right? So I think in 2005 it was just a very different. It doesn't seem that long ago. Well, it does for me, but it doesn't seem that long ago. But I think audiences were very different back then. The Asian market and the subtitle market, movies like Schindler's List, all these things, they start in a different language and then it transitions pretty quickly over into English so that the audiences can actually stay more focused. But yeah, I think that would apply now, and I wonder if they redid this again or re-engage this project in 2021, how different it would be by being more authentic.
This would make a great miniseries.
Oh yeah.
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 Perhaps Nobu-san will be kind enough to explain the rules of the match.
3 things matter in life: small, business, and war. Understand one? You know them all. But why should a geisha care? You spend your time plucking strings and dancing.
I humbly beg to differ. What is sumo but a dance between giants? What is business but a dance between companies? I'd like to know about every kind of dance.
Would the term Oscar bait be appropriate?
For this?
Only because a movie that came out a couple years earlier and I think it did end up winning Best Picture, was another historical epic, Cold Mountain. And I think on paper, I think I read the synopsis to Cold Mountain, like a man, a Confederate soldier, Jude Law, has to run back, make it his way through the North to go back to the South and his epic journey. And I remember a couple years ago checking it out, and I found myself once again incredibly bored by it. I found it surprisingly boring.
That was Cold Mountain, right?
Yeah, Cold Mountain.
Mountain. Yeah.
And I think the beginning and Renee Zellweger are like the things to latch onto, but I think definitely. I mean, this was made for $85 million. I think people really kind of wanted to ride that, like, oh, historical epics, when we're gonna get the best of the best, and they did get once. I think it's important. Like, John Williams dropped out of Harry Potter. He's like, I don't want to do Goblet of Fire. I actually want to write music for this, and the score is excellent.
It is.
There's a lot of production aspects to this that I find A+.
Yeah, it's interesting that I guess the source material was something that really resonated with all these big Hollywood figures, that they all really wanted to be a part of this project. And
I heard it's a good book. It did very well, and it came out in '97. I heard it did very well, and the guy did his research. He also outed he made the controversy that I found. He outed the geisha, like he said her name, like she was my source, and that
that would be
caused
a
a whole, like, you can't do that in the geisha. Like, they found out who, like, they broke the code. I don't want to say there's like a geisha code, but yeah, it broke the code.
No, I agree. I think there is something to be said about that world being a bit secretive, or maybe very secretive, and not being something that you would share with outsiders all of the inner workings of. So to do so is interesting for us. Like, we want to know, but that's not really something that the people part of that world really want to share as much with everyone else.
And the other thing, I feel like the fact that we kind of connected them with prostitutes was the auctioning off their virginity. I think that wasn't a regular thing for geishas, but that portion made me think, I don't know, that they were perhaps almost like prostitutes in some way.
Well, that's the one element that was like sex being part of their profession, the auctioning of the virginity. Yeah, which I that's interesting, and I need to like look into see if that was really a thing. For all I know, it could have or could not have been, but there was nothing really else about what they were doing that was sexual, right? I mean, they would again entertain men or maybe flirt with men to some degree, but for the most part, their craft was focused on artistry. So you have that one element that's a major plot point in the movie. Who, by the way, the winner of that auction winds up being Dr. Crab, right? Which
The
like
Keymaster from the Matrix movies.
oh okay, I didn't realize that was
Yeah,
Yeah,
the
it was.
Keymaker.
but
Yeah, I was like, where have I seen this guy before?
between that was the couple of names in this movie that made me laugh: Dr. Crab and Pumpkin, because they're just so not Japanese names. I think they explained that Dr. Crab is like a nickname or something, but the whole time, anytime he's on screen, I just kept saying, "Oh, look, it's Dr. Crab. Dr. Crab won your virginity." It's just like a weird sort of name to
I
have.
think they just translate it into English funny. If they went with
Yep.
the Japanese names, it'd probably sound a bit more authentic.
Yeah, it sounds like Doctor like gives you the crabs or something. And then Pumpkin, that is such like an American nickname. Again, I don't know if maybe there's like a Japanese. I'm sure like in any culture there are pet names that you give people, but Pumpkin, that is such to me like a southern sort of thing. Like Pumpkin, like where are you? And then to have this character have that name when everyone else is very authentic sounding Japanese names also kind of stuck out.
Yeah,
That
and
was
that's the one Japanese character is named after a Western squash,
yeah.
right? And I don't even know if pumpkins made it to Japan by that time. But I imagine there was a Japanese word for it
Yeah.
that made more sense.
Yeah, I like that's the thing. It's a little unclear at times what is supposed to be like a representation in English of something Japanese and it's just being like the equivalent, or what is just actually something that's just Japanese and you have to take it for what it is. And then
I can hear the screenwriter
yeah,
going like, all right, we don't know. I'm just gonna give her a pumpkin. Like that's gonna be the name.
like too lazy to think of Japanese pet names and just or nothing that really he liked and just settled on an American one. The character I actually was most interested in watching this was the Hatsumomo character, so the older geisha who's, I guess, more or less sort of the villain of the movie in a way. But even though she's like, I feel like she could be seen as this one-dimensional mean character, I actually found her very compelling because I feel like that actress brings a sense of pain, like an inner pain that the character has, and it made the character work. It was,
Are we talking about Gong Li?
Gong Li,
Yeah.
yeah,
yeah,
Li Gong.
Even her look, her hair, she really exemplified that kind of like pained kind of bitchiness that you can relate to a bit.
I feel like the whole movie she kind of is exemplifying a sort of like, she has a sort of rebellious spirit to her, but more or less she has surrendered to this world of being a geisha that she does not really want to be a part of. So the whole time she has this resentment towards almost everybody, which I thought was performed in a very believable way.
I believe that we know when her exit when she was burning down the house. I actually believed it. And how she just walks away. The walking away is very interesting to me, and compelling.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think she was really well developed too. Gong Li, Li Gong, whichever way you want to go with it. She was, like I said, a very established, actress in China at the time. So she really lent a lot of emotion, and she was one of the few that you could see in the cast that added some depth to their character. Japanese movies, if you watch them, especially if there's any kind of romance or any kind of drama, it's usually very melodramatic, right? They're very sudden, very, massive movements and dramatic faces, kabuki faces. You don't see that much in many of the characters. Again, Zhang Ziyi, who was in a movie I think it was the same year, called 2046 by Wong Kar-wai. She seems like a completely different character from when I saw her in 2046 to Memoirs of a Geisha, where she's very like toned down and subtle. But Li Gong, I thought she added a lot of emotion to, being the struggling, villain. I guess she is a villain, like you said.
Geisha villain.
Yeah,
I
never
kind of
really.
wanted I
Yeah,
kind of
go ahead.
wanted more. I
You
like
did?
she was great, but like I think this movie did a lot of really good setup in the beginning.
Hmm.
I was like very invested, and she's hooking up with a man and he's like finding her, like this is sin basically.
Well,
And then
he says something about like, oh, I hate having to sneak around. And I guess as a geisha, she can't really have a relationship with a man because she has to keep her purity, and that's not really the role of a geisha to have like a love interest. But
but once Zhang grew up and started really applying herself as a geisha, I feel like everyone kind of fell into their, like, she became the ugly stepsister trope,
mm,
and I kind of wanted more, personally.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And then she just disappears, right? Like,
Yeah, I'm like, that's it? No, no, I don't want her, like, her comeuppance in that way, but I wanted a closed arc as opposed to just like she's exiled.
Well, she's cast out for nearly burning the house down, which I guess is like a big metaphor for her destroying the like metaphorical house, right? Like the house of like that mother, and thus she's cast out, and it's ambiguous what happens to her. So I find it interesting because then there's also the ambiguity of what happens to the sister character, right? She's unable to meet up with her sister when they plan to, and she never heard from her sister again. So there's like I buy like for the longest time, there was no way of knowing what happened to certain people if you just weren't able to like keep touch with them, and I feel like that added. I kind of like the ambiguity of it because I feel like that adds more to the tragedy of it. People come and go, and you might not know whatever happened to them, especially in uncertain times. And for her to walk out like that, you can even see for the Hatsumono character when the last shot of her, I think, is when she looks the most vulnerable because it's like she's given everything to this house and to this profession, and she's still miserable, and now she has nothing. So I find that was like maybe I had to like do my own work and invest more than the movie's giving me, but I ultimately did find that effective as a tragic character.
yeah, and but like I think you hinted at it earlier, is that she could never really conform to the requirements of being a geisha, which is what, in the end, is what leads to her fall, right?
She's never successful because she is that.
Yeah.
Yeah, her exile.
And also, I feel like Pumpkin essentially did learn from her. She became her because she betrayed Sayori.
Well, yeah,
That's the thing.
that was probably the most melodramatic part of the movie towards the end, when, she tries to get Pumpkin to like go along with this scheme so she can like turn off Nobu. Nobu catches her with the Colonel, but instead Pumpkin brings the chairman, knowing what she's doing like that was a very soap opera-ish moment, right? Like, oh, you brought the wrong guy and you betrayed me, and all these things. It was like that was very melodramatic, and so I can see something like that being very soap opera-ish.
But it shows like who are whose mentors, right? Because Hatsumomo was Pumpkin's mentor, and Mama-san was her. No,
Mamiya?
Mamiya was Michelle Yeoh's character was Mameha, was the mentor for Sayuri. So you see the complete dichotomy there of like how they're raised. One, look out for yourself and personal revenge, and one look for the greater society in your business.
Right, that was like the payoff of Pumpkin, spending all that time with the cruel Hatsumomo as her mentor. But I guess maybe it was in the direction of it, and the reveal of the chairman looking in and being shocked and horrified, that felt like the most of like a shocking soap opera moment, where maybe like in a TV show you hear like an organ like dun dun dun, and then how could you betray me, that kind of thing.
A character that I actually enjoyed was Okasan, the Mama-san, the lady with the long cigarette where the cigarette pointed upwards.
Yeah.
What a classy way to smoke that cigarette.
I want a pipe like that. I don't smoke cigarettes, but I might take it up now.
Yeah, a cigarette pipe, I guess you would call it, or a pipe cigarette.
Kind of beautiful.
Yeah, I don't know. I like. She was probably one of the more authentic of all the characters. She was strict but fair. really all about the success of the business. And it was played very well, I think, by that. I don't even know who that actress is.
Well, she also conveyed the other concept of being a geisha, which is the whole thing of having a debt when you're taken in as a geisha, because she pays, basically she buys these women, these as girls, and that's like the start of their debt, what they were paid for, and then all the money has to be invested in them to go to school and be trained and for their clothing and all these things, and that's like the debts that they have to pay back through their work, which is also very interesting because they're basically like at that point like indentured servants. And that's actually something we learned too. So Eric and I, after watching this, we were inspired to learn more about geishas, right? Like what's like the real thing. So we started watching this documentary that Amazon had suggested after we finished watching this movie, as Amazon is wont to do. And it was like a 2005 documentary that probably was made in response to this movie. And that was like one of the first things that were going on is like the debts. You know, these geishas are working back to repay the money that's been invested to them, and that's how these geisha houses make money.
Speaking of the history, geishas used to be men. They used to be like jesters, remember?
That's right.
There was a period in the early feudal Japan where it was both. They had men and women, but there were male geishas. It was not uncommon.
That's like you mentioned kabuki before. I remember learning in my theater history class in college that the interesting history behind like kabuki, for example, was that it was initially something performed with young women, but I guess that kind of lent itself to a situation where there was a lot of prostitution with these like young women actresses, and the country banned young women from being in these kabuki shows to prevent that from happening. So then young men were acting in these shows, but then the young men were taking part in the prostitution. So then young men were banned from kabuki theater, and then that's why traditionally now for many centuries, kabuki theater actors are older men, the least likely people to be prostitutes, I suppose.
Essentially.
Yeah, but it's interesting, like, you know, the geisha art form, the kabuki art form. I mean, these are still held in very high regard in Japanese society. I mean, they're like basically their national heritage. And even if the whole geisha economy is nothing like it was before World War II, it is still something that they treasure to some degree.
There's another thing. So I studied kabuki as well in World of Dance in college, and we performed kabuki as well. And it was very interesting because it really is storytelling through like movement, and I feel like if they portrayed that more in the movie instead of all this dialogue, they actually showed the artistry of movement and telling the story that way, I think it would have been kind of successful.
Yeah, like focused more. There were some, what I appreciated about the movie, and I still like the movie, right? I don't dislike the movie, but it's how they touched on all these different parts of Japanese society or Japanese culture. Yes, they touch on, at a surface area, the surface value of what it's like to be a geisha, but they remember there's a portion of the movie where they go to the sumo wrestling match, where they kind of explain like what sumo is. It's not just two big men pushing each other around. That there's an art to it as well. There's a science to it as well. How you win, how the smaller person can win, and that's probably also a bit of
purifies the ring and
the salt. Yeah, but also I think there was a bit of foreshadowing there how, the smaller sumo wrestler could beat the larger sumo wrestler. So it's like Sayuri versus Hatsumomo by just using the right technique. So, I mean, I did like how they walked through a little bit of that. I think they did some of the tea making. I think it was really good to kind of expose that to the audience, the Western audiences, a bit more than it had been at the time.
Yeah, some of these art forms that are like something like calligraphy is something that's more considered an art form in like Asian cultures and like in Western cultures. Like, obviously we're taught in school like, proper handwriting and such, but it's not really considered to be as in the same tier of an art form as, say, like music or, like dance, something like that. That's of, very sophisticated artistry. And then, something like pouring the tea. There's a whole performance to everything they do. Even there's an art of conversation that they have.
Wittiness, yeah.
Yeah. So there's something to be said about that. And even the training, like the pain they put themselves through, how she has to sleep uncomfortably to learn the proper physicalities and things like that. So that was all interesting. And so I would say this movie shouldn't be considered like a full education on the art form of geisha, but maybe as an introductory to people who don't really know. And again, you can then, if you're interested in learning more, you can. And it's, take it for what it is. It is for the most part, focusing more on the story and being dramatic and falling into some cliches at times. But you can definitely see it as also a gateway into learning about a culture that if you don't really know much about it to begin with, a gateway, not like a total, accurate representation.
Yeah, like a glimpse. I think Keith hit the nail on the head there by saying you could expand on this story a lot more in a miniseries and give people a better perspective if it was several hour long or whatever, hour and a half long episodes, because you could develop everyone better. And it's hard to pack all of that in a 2-ish hour
They
movie.
got the details right. I think a miniseries, and I hope you're listening, Netflix or HBO Max or whoever owns Memoirs over Gay. You would get the emotional attachment right too, or at least like a real chance to grow these characters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree, because like anything else, critics are always going to be critical of movies that don't flesh out the characters as much as they would like. The critics always look for the more human element of movies, and not to say this movie doesn't have a human element to it. I think it does, but they always want more from that, and that's why I'm seeing the divide. Why critics are very much more negative on this than audiences is because they see a lot of this as being like surface level storytelling, whereas audiences, I think, again, are being intrigued by a culture they're not as familiar with, and also hitting a lot of familiar beats and emotions that maybe they get from other movies in terms of like a character growing and succeeding in hardship. So maybe some of that are cliched things you see, but these are things that will always resonate with audiences, and maybe critics just see them one too many times. But I don't think you've ever really seen them in American movies like this, in this kind of setting with these kinds of people. So I think critics maybe should give this a little more credit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the romanticizing of this really did connect with Americans well. I think that's the thing that made audience really into it.
Yeah, romanticizing, that's like the perfect word for it. Because maybe it was like more, as much as you see the struggle of this character, in real life is probably even like 10 times more harsh, and people suffered way more trying to climb up the ranks and what life was like back then. So you're right.
You are rooting for her.
Yeah, you are. But I wonder if the rating had anything to do with it, if you could keep it that way as a PG-13, or how much further, or how much more you could have expanded on it as a rated R movie. But I'm sure those restrictions kind of, again, restricted the story developing.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, this is a story. It's an American film, like, with Asian actors, but for the most part, it is catering to an American audience, told through an American studio. Well, and so that can, dilute that authenticity we're looking for, and that's ultimately probably like my biggest problem. But the idea of this movie itself, I don't have an issue with, but that seems to be something that the critics have an issue with.
And I believe I agree with you about the whole. This is a gateway to really showing off the Eastern culture and everything. Because I didn't know about geishas until this movie came out. Like geishas were even in like hip hop songs. I think they're like something like a geisha, and like that's still 2000s. But anyways, like I just feel that geishas were connected to beauty. Like I remember we would call like a beautiful Asian woman or Japanese woman a geisha. I don't know why. That's what I guess in those songs that came out, or like Americans would kind of title beautiful Asian women. I remember even my fraternity brother like said I looked like a geisha in a photo because I was photoshopped, and it was my headshot with like a salmon shirt and a floral bow tie. So it was like it's seen as like Japanese beauty.
Right. More like in American culture, a more vague term used more loosely which is the opposite of what it is. It's like a very specific kind of role with a very specific set of high standards for what qualifies as a geisha. But again, they hint on that in the movie. After World War II, that standard was diluted, and the art form declined in numbers and maybe like declined in standards. Although there is, from what I understand, some effort to preserve that high standards for, just in much smaller numbers.
I wish you could have told me long ago.
What could I do? I owe Nobu my life. And so, when I saw he had a chance at happiness with you, I stood silent. But I cannot any longer. I hope it is not too late.
I guess at the end of the day, it sounds like we're in the process of getting to a conclusion here.
Getting there,
yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like it. What did I enjoy the movie? Yes, I definitely enjoyed the movie. Went out to the theater. I bought the DVD. But then you look at it, it took me 17 years to watch it again. 16, 17 years to watch it for a third time. I think the story does a really good job, like I said, or at least the movie does a very good job telling a story, right, in a very linear fashion, portraying it very beautifully. If I would best describe it, it would be an Eastern story with, like you said, with an Asian cast, seen through a Western lens and with a Western denouement. Because if it was really Asian, if it was really Japanese, the ending would be extremely different. I think after the betrayal of Pumpkin, Sayuri wouldn't have thrown the handkerchief. She probably would have jumped off the cliff. And I think, what's his name, the chairman, would realize that and say, oh my God, why didn't I tell her before? And he too would have committed suicide. That would have been an Asian end to this kind of story.
Like dramatic Asian.
Very more tragic.
Yeah, right. It would be a lot more tragic and maybe resound more with Eastern audiences.
Note to self. Chairman would be like, note to self, don't say something next time.
Yeah. And in a Japanese movie, he probably would have killed himself. So that's what really, I've been thinking about that since I first watched the movie. Like, the ending is a little Western. It's fairy tale ending. They're happy ever after. But in a real Japanese movie, that would not have happened, and they would probably both be dead.
Interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Again, like the romanticization of it all. That probably is like the most unauthentic thing about it. So on that note, though, I think we can then get into like our final scores. So, Gene, I kind of take that as your final take on this movie. So what would your like percentage score be? Like, on, if we're going back to like, if you're a teacher grading this movie on a scale of 0 to 100, what would your score be?
That's a tough one because, like I said, I enjoyed the movie. I enjoyed watching it the second time, or the third time, which was very recently, right? Because of the storytelling, because of the amount of effort that was put into giving us all a glimpse of what that really secretive life looked like, and giving us interesting characters, which maybe weren't super developed, but were still interesting enough to watch the whole movie, right? I'd probably give it somewhere between a 65 and a 70, maybe 70, just because the acting was pretty solid, in my opinion. It wasn't amazing, but it was pretty solid. It was a good cast. But again, the distractions were the Chinese cast, I guess I wouldn't say the lack of, but maybe the lack of respect towards Japanese culture, the lack of authenticity, and the non-Eastern storyline ending are the few things that bothered me the most. But yeah, 65 to 70. Okay. Let's say 70. Be decisive.
Okay, yeah, there you go. All right, so 70. And then what about Eric? What were your final thoughts and your score?
So this movie was actually, back in the day when it came out, I had MySpace. It's listed under one of my favorite movies on MySpace. That's the thing, like, I felt like this fulfilled my Asian pride obsession. I'm like, oh my gosh, maybe about Japanese culture and about geishas, so cool. So I watched it. I was into it, the whole romanticism, being young. I was into that whole storyline, making it dramatic, soap opera. Now, watching it now, I do agree, actually. The authenticity, I would like to see more of that. And also with Japanese actors. Like, I feel like I wish there were more Japanese actors in this. And the controversy, that's obviously an issue. But the thing is, I did like this movie, and I still find it beautiful. I like her running through that little walkway. I thought that's so beautiful, seeing a little girl doing that, and then even seeing the mountains in the background, the roofing. It really gets you excited about Japan. Like I remember we even watched some movies together, such as what's that movie again?
Lost in Translation.
Lost in Translation,
Great
and just
movie.
seeing that movie, great movie, not divided, unfortunately, but like that movie is great because it really shows a culture that's more modern, and I don't know, like just having these little bits and pieces of Japanese culture gets us excited. So I guess with the rating wise, I would give this a 78. Maybe a little higher than I thought I would give it, but I'm going back to watching the past and comparing to it now, and this is my average of it.
Okay, so not as enthusiastic, but still pretty positive. You know what? With Lost in Translation, it could be a good double feature, right? Because you get like one movie that's like about a previous time period in Japan, and then another movie that's more modern. Although both are told through Western lenses, and
this movie's 2.5 hours.
It's not to do double feature when one movie is over 2.5 hours, but still, like maybe they could be companion pieces or something. I don't know.
Yeah, watch if you haven't yet. I don't know how you'd put them on, how you'd recommend it, but those old Akira Kurosawa movies are great insights in Japan. They're but very Japanese in that they're very violent, they're very tragic, and very, very gory. But Seven Samurai, Yojimbo, Ran.
Akira is one of my favorites.
The anime Akira?
No, Akiru. Aikiru? The one where the Japanese man gets he gets told he has cancer. I had to watch it for a class, and I found it, like, as you said, very enthralling and painful. But it was such a great drama, and like Akira Kurosawa is one of the better directors out there, definitely.
Yeah.
And the whole drama aspect, that's the thing. Like, I felt like this movie was predictable. Like, I knew that Mamaya was actually, like, it was all in cahoots with the chairman. It was kind of obvious with that, because he would just show up randomly, like, come on.
Yeah, the story could be predictable at times, which is another thing critics aren't a fan of. But it's, like, a comforting thing for American audiences when they can stick to a more familiar storyline. So there you have it, another thing critics are not a fan of, but audiences enjoy. But Keith, it sounds like you're about to give us your score. So what do you think?
There's a lot of things that I do appreciate about this movie, even aside from production. This conversation, like, I think we hit a lot of points in this conversation that make me even appreciate it. I appreciate that I saw it as my first time. I do think it fits into those, like, Oscar type movies that I saw once and really don't need to see again, except if I'm doing a podcast about divided movies. This movie is 2.5 hours, and there were times I remember pausing several times and going like, "Oh my God, there's an hour left." Like I found it definitely lagged a few times for me, and it. I wanted to care a lot more about these characters' journeys aside from the predictability of it. I'm gonna give it a 52. It is watchable, but there's something that's preventing it from being, and the more research I did on it, there's something that's preventing it from being like one of the best movies.
Yeah. Okay. Now I dig that. Which that's critical, but it's still not as low as the critical score. Isn't it like 30-something% with the critics, like really too low for
this? Is the same average between like this and The Butterfly Effect. It's like 48.
Yeah,
difference.
We've talked about some really bad movies that have similar critical scores, which seems kind of wrong to me. Yeah, so with my score, I did enjoy this more than I thought I would, and I agree, Keith, that it does tend to lag at times. Like there are scenes that I really enjoy. Like I like the sumo scene when she is actually able to get on Mr. Nobu's good side, and he's kind of like a tough cookie to crack, but she's able to win him over. Things like that, where the character is growing. But then other scenes that generally work with me is like when they go to, what is it, the General's cherry blossom event. That seemed to me a scene that I didn't really care for or really add much, and it was a long sequence. It was like a good 10-15 minute sequence, things like that. So it's 2.5 hours. I don't think it needed to be, especially when not all of it is growing. You would think in 2.5 hours you could develop these characters, and they don't as well as they could have. But I did ultimately enjoy it, and so I would give this like a 72. So Keith will do the math there. What's our average score?
I once again find it appropriate, a 68.
68. That sounds about right.
That sounds about right for me.
Yeah, me
Watchable, but watch it again in a decade.
Yeah, exactly.
And those movies do exist. Like,
absolutely. I can see what you mean too about it being like a very Oscar bait kind of movie, or a movie made for Oscar season. And
historical epics, man. Like
that was popular at the time, the 2000s. You had a lot of period pieces that were epic.
This year, though. This was Lord of the Rings. All won. The Return of the King won that year, didn't they?
That was a couple years earlier, I believe, 2003. So if this was 2005, I think actually was that the year $1 Million Baby was like the best movie of the year.
There were good movies that year. There was like Syriana.
King Kong came out.
Yeah,
like, it came out around the same time King Kong came out, and I think it did kind of hurt it in the box office.
Yeah.
Or was it? That was the last Star Wars movie.
Yeah, it was $1 Million Baby.
Yeah, that was 2005. But I would say, going back to our point about how this could be a gateway movie into Japanese culture when one is not familiar, and then if you really want authentic Japanese movies, or Japanese movies that are authentic about Japanese culture, watch Japanese cinema and some of the titles that Gene mentioned, and then you go straight to the source. Basically, then you won't have it through a diluted lens or a Western lens. You'd have it being Japanese culture told by Japanese people, which is the best way to experience that kind of storytelling in an authentic way. So start here, and then, or you can just dive head first into it as well if you want to. Maybe you don't have to go through a movie like this first. Just go right into that. Japanese film industry, and there's a lot to start with. So, but for this movie, Memoirs of a Geisha, I will decree that we are officially siding with the audience. So controversies aside, we did enjoy it, but we did make note of them. So asterisks, side with audiences, but asterisks. About
I don't know how to add that sound effect.
You'll find something that works. But great discussion, guys.
Yes, thank you.
Eric, Gene, thanks for joining us for this episode. I think this was a great discussion on this movie, and we hit all the points that we needed to.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, thanks for joining, Jane. This is great for you to visit and do our podcast.
Yeah, exactly. Next time you're in town, maybe we'll do another one.
They're digital. Hit me up anytime.
Oh, that's true. We do these remotely too. So we'll let you know if there's another movie that we have a good discussion with you about. But thanks everyone for listening as always, and join us again for another Divided Film.